This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome, everybody. Carl and I are flying solo today. For those of you that are regular guests, regular visitors to the show, listeners to the show, consumers of the content, we always endeavor to find people to join us and chat about things. We've really had a wealth. I think it was a lot easier. It used to be a lot easier to get people to come on, but now that life has gotten, back to the way it was, sort of pre-pandemic, it gets trickier and trickier. And I think we tried 4 or 5 different people, Carl, in areas we're going to talk about today. But again, I think it's no problem for Carl and I to cover this information in the fastest 30 minutes in turf to give you some things to think about. And there is nothing more important to think about in the world than opening day tomorrow at Yankee Stadium. It will be my old buddy Dan Cunningham's 36th opening day as the head groundskeeper. And so we'll just give a shout out to all the great sports field managers that don't, toil every day in obscurity. No one really knows what they're doing. And big shout out to the Met and the Long Island superintendents for continuing to sponsor this effort. So, Carl, I always like to start with a couple of interesting pictures, and sports turf and baseball is on everybody's mind. And of course, there isn't really a turf person that doesn't love a good picture with a turf person and a dog. So having a dog sitting on a thing really warms my heart. Now, I think the other little thing I saw on in social media this week was the number of golf courses that are out there in America. And so you see now this is a fairly recent, March 2024. I can remember when this number was in excess of 18,000. We have definitely shrunk over the last 20 years. And what I think is really fascinating is when you start to look at, the only Northeastern state that's up in the how many people per golf course is Vermont, with 9,500 people per golf courses, because they only have 68. In Vermont, whereas New York State at 833 doesn't make that list. We got a lot of people and a lot of golf courses and a lot of people per golf courses. So, Carl, I just thought I'd set you up pretty good here. I saw what you're going to rant about today, and I've been doing this on Twitter fairly intentionally. Whenever I see somebody rolling or purposely using traffic, in this case, it was Jim Pavanetti's work, just sort of smoothing out the putting surfaces before you put the greens on, or before you put the mowers on them. And of course, I don't think a lot of people know this is also a very effective way of managing foliar pathogens like dollar spot and microdochium. The microdochium snow mold, the pink snow mold, as we used to call it. Some old timers still call it fusarium patch, and we got to get them into modern times, Carl. But I know you've got something to say about this.
Yeah, so actually a tweet the other day sort of sparked my my thoughts on this. But I'm going to call this rant today. I guess in the past I've done BMP tips of the day, and now I think we're getting on to rants now. Finally, is the cost of doing more, and very often I think in turf systems, rightfully so, managers are arguing for more labor, better equipment, oftentimes just a little bit more money for seed or fertilizer or pesticides. And I think that's justified in a lot of cases, that and a lot of, especially golf courses and sports fields, are very sort of under-resourced. But then there's also times when I see people doing more where, what is the cost of that, right? So I want to take sort of a cost-benefit analysis, almost an economist's view of this sort of thing today. And this is the tweet that started. Pat Jones does his power walks. I always enjoy. He's got little videos of when he's walking around his different neighborhoods in Ohio, and he found these bent grass lawns. Cut at a half an inch, and they've got pink snow mold all over them. And so he makes a comment, in these rich areas, I think this is Shaker Heights out there in Ohio. For whatever reason, they got these all over the place. Rich people are odd. I thought this was a really good way to finish that tweet. So probably the wrong plant in the wrong place. But one of the comments to that tweet was this question, and it was, you ever wonder what the turf would look like in the spring without fungicides? And it's sort of a rhetorical question, like, hey, this is why we need a snow mold application. I actually think it's just a good question in general, not rhetorical. Like, what does the turf look like if we don't use snow mold applications? And we've been sort of figuring that out in Ithaca, New York, the last couple of years. The Cornell golf course post-COVID had its budget cut pretty good. And one of the first things to go was snow mold applications. So that first year after COVID, they started each year after that. We haven't applied snow mold to the fairways, snow mold preventative fungicides. And the first year that happened, we got a ton of snow mold. So for those watching, you can see, you know, in some cases, 40–50% of the turf is infected here with pink snow mold. So in this case, okay, the cost of not applying was whatever we're going to do to that surface to renovate it. Is it some seed? Is it some fertilizer early in the season? Is it some scratching up the turf, creating a seed bed? Maybe there's some labor and equipment involved in that. And then you got a couple of weeks of below average conditions, right? So in this case, it took about 4 weeks to sort of get this back to normal. So those are all the costs. Now, in other years, the 3 years since then, we have seen no snow mold damage. So the picture I'm showing here is of great turf, late April, looks beautiful. And this was without a fungicide app for snow mold. So in 3 out of the last 4 years where we haven't applied, we've got no snow mold pressure and it looks really good. To go to your opening day comments, Frank, that's an on-base percentage of 75%, right? So we're batting at 75%.
Almost as good as Juan Soto. Almost
That's
as good
right,
as Juan
yeah.
Soto.
This is if he keeps it up, right? So it's limited data, right? But the idea for me is, hey, if we had applied a fungicide in those 3 years when we didn't need to, there's a cost associated with that, you know, more, quote unquote. It's the labor to make the snow mold app, and it's the snow mold app itself, which is very expensive. I've got 3,000 listed on here. It could probably get you to 7,000 or 8,000, depending on what products you're using, how much acreage you've got. So that's a, you know, sort of baseline cost. Okay, that's something that we didn't need that. But then there's all these hidden costs that I think we're starting to find out now. So it's not just the dollars and cents, but hey, every time we make a fungicide application, in this case, hey, we might get a little bit more resistance or insensitivity. So this was a recent article released by the UMass folks, Dr. Guma Zheng and his graduate student, Sun Hong Ming. They got a bunch of samples from golf courses last year of dollar spot, and they tested those dollar spot populations against different fungicides and figured out, okay, how many have insensitivity or resistance to these different modes of action? What they found was every single course they got a sample from had resistance or insensitivity to at least 2 modes of actions of fungicides. And then 2 courses out of the 16 had insensitivity or resistance to every single fungicide they tested it on. Right. So the idea here is that if you're applying one more application per year, maybe on your fairways or your greens, you're increasing your risk of having some resistance there. Right. And then all of a sudden you get 3 or 4 years on. We heard this, you know, a month or so ago down Long Island is I used to get 21 days. Now I only get like 14 days or 12 days. And right over time, when you make that one extra application each year, you're increasing that risk of resistance, and then you're locking yourself in a box. And actually, every single sample they got was insensitive to DMIs, right? So this idea of, hey, we're sort of restricting ourselves every time we make another application. And then there's some data here from Kyle Wicking's lab in 2017, where essentially he looked at fairways that had 0 pesticides applied every year, a low intensity program, 2 apps per year, and then a high intensity program, 6 apps per year. And what he found was, hey, the good things in the soil, in this case, the decomposers, when you get to that high intensity pesticide program, you see significant drops in that decomposer abundance. And we want those. We want them to cycle nutrients. We got a lot of organic matter in turf systems, right? We'd like them to cycle that through and sort of chew that up. The more pesticides we apply, the lower the ability the soil has to sort of function and do its thing. And just the other day, Frank, we got a chance to sit in on Dr. Mingyi Chow's. He presented up here at Cornell from Rutgers. He's got some dollar spot research where he's finding, hey, these certain soils have natural suppressive abilities for dollar spot, just inherent ability to sort of suppress that pathogen, but only if you make few pesticide applications. When he got samples from courses who applied a lot of pesticides in a given year, they had very little natural suppression. So again, going to this idea of, hey, that extra app, if there's snow mold, if it's for dollar spot, if it's for weeds or insects too, man, you may get some negative effects in the soil. So finishing up, I got the little, you know, the picture of the iceberg, right? And the tip of the iceberg is just the dollars and cents stuff that we think about, right? So, hey, I want to make a snow mold app. It's, you know, $3,000 or $5,000. But then below the surface is all the sort of costs that we don't actually, you know, long-term costs or hidden costs that we don't think about. Is it the resistance? It's the, hey, what's the effect on the soil? we talk about all the time, Frank, environmental, water quality, pollinator risk. I didn't even mention any of that today, but that's usually what we're ranting about. So all these things, what could you have used that $3,000 on besides the application, right? So all these hidden costs, and I just want to sort of point that out today, is not that you can't do more, and not that more is not always the best option, but let's just think sort of, long term, what are sort of the hidden costs we might incur, and use that to sort of balance our decision making.
Yeah. And a couple of things. This is brilliant. And a couple of things. One is just to remind everybody, we treat our greens at Cornell, right?
Yeah.
We treat the greens, right? But we're talking about the difference between 3 acres and 30 acres, right? So that's the first thing to always keep in mind, right, Carl, when we're talking about these things. Number two, you talked about it last week. It isn't just a matter of saving a spray. It's a matter of the pressures getting worse. I mean, literally, you probably see 90 to 100 straight days during the year when dollar spot's going to be pressure on Long Island, in particular down in the Met area, right? And there's other things that are going on that are driving this. And so in sociological terms, they call them externalities. These are externalities. These are things that you don't pay for when you do what you do. Like we eat meat or we drink milk, and then the nitrogen on the farms in the Midwest wind up in the river and cause dead zones in the Gulf, and we don't pay. Who pays for that, right? So these sorts of externalities are important. So let's get to some more cheery topics like the weather, right? And so soils are now in the low 40s to low 50s, north to south. And again, for those of you paying attention, this hasn't changed much in the last couple of weeks. It's sort of sitting there, right? Let me keep my numbers going here. And air temperature wise, it's been cooler to the north and west, and warmer to the south and east. Now, this particular image doesn't necessarily depict that because it doesn't always account for the most recent days, but you can see some cooler temperatures and some warmer temperatures. But again, we're definitely in a bit of a stall when you consider this map had nothing but above normal temperatures on it 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's almost all below normal temperatures now. And so I thought, because I'm building to sort of the concern about this, and to Carl's point, what's some of the cost of the things we do? Let's start out with something simple for our landscape and grounds folks thinking about crabgrass control, particularly our professional lawn care operators who might have to cover 3,000-4,000 customers in a short period of time. First off, we know that 80% of the germination of crabgrass will occur when soil temperatures are 0 to 2 inches, at the 0 to 2 inch depth of 60 to 70 degrees, right? Let's just go back here to remind you where we are, or remind you where we are right now. We're in the 40s and 50s, okay? So we're going to maybe get averaging into the 60s next week, but that's not going to move the soils that warm, particularly when it's wet like it's been. So what do we do to predict these things? We use phenological indicators, or we use the GDD tracker that Kevin Frank and the Michigan State Sparties use to tell us what's going on. And you can see when you look at this, we're well under when crabgrass is going to germinate. It'd be hard to imagine moving into this thing in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So while I understand there's pressure to get things out there, right? You're giving up at least 3 weeks of control here by getting it on now, when there's no crabgrass germinating all the way past into the Delmarva Peninsula. You're still well ahead of it. So again, don't fall prey to the commercials. Don't fall prey to people saying you gotta get out there. You gotta get out there. And again, I understand professional lawn care applicators got to get stuff done, but man, you got to know what you're giving up when you particularly go this early. Now, this is on our Cornell Guidelines website. It's not new information. Joe Neal developed this years and years ago when, we're talking 30 years ago. But interestingly, these are still the chemicals we use. This is a measure of herbicides haven't changed very much, particularly from a pre-emergent perspective. And you can see almost all of them are good for 4 to 6 weeks. And then it starts dropping off into the 12 to 15 weeks. You only have a few that are very excellent. And, dithiopyr or dimension and prodiamine are a couple of them that actually hold on and are pretty good. Right now, when you think about this, again, when you think about the herbicide concentration you've got to keep in the soil, right? You apply the product as a liquid or a granular, and then it becomes soluble and it sits there in the soil, right? And then it solubilizes and leaks, right? It breaks down when the soils start to get warm, right? And then its concentration goes down, which means the chemical is breaking down and releasing into the environment, and it's not effective anymore in preventing germination. And so there's a period of time when that concentration can stay in that zone where it will keep crabgrass and annual grass seedlings from emerging, and then when it drops below. So like I said, previously, it can be as little as 4 to 6 weeks. It can be as much as 12 to 14 weeks. But if you've already given up 3 weeks because you put it on 3 weeks ago, now you only got 9 weeks left. And I don't even want to talk about having to make another pre-emergent application later in the season. So let's get to the major weather issue and bring this thing around to the real costs here, right? It's been wet. This graph doesn't even represent what's going on. But we talked to Nick Menchik in Pittsburgh today. He got 3 to 4 inches out there, right? We got people soaked along the coast. I'm sure on Long Island it was 2 to 3 inches easy across the island. And this is pretty significant because it came on top of some pretty wet conditions to begin with. And again, to our sports fields, brothers and sisters, this is a rough go. I mean, these kids are chomping at the bit. And I know Ben may or may not be listening, and Ben is a regular participant in this thing. And I don't even think sneakers are going to help us in this. I know Ben keeps the kids on sneakers on these early fields. But, here is the argument. And I'm going to take a hard, I don't love it. But this is the argument for a synthetic surface in a community. This is the argument for it, right? If you're going to get out there and be active. And Carl, I was walking on a synthetic field last week in Seattle where the cork was in there. So now it's no more rubber, it's cork. Yeah, it's very interesting. And in fact, they had just put it on. It needs a bunch of water to settle. It actually moves around a little bit more than the rubber does and compacts a little bit more than the rubber does. So, these things are still unfolding about what synthetic turf. We'll get the synthetic turf probably next week. We'll talk about fertilizers as well. Now, over the next couple of weeks, it looks like it's going to get warm and warm up quite a bit, and then still be wet. So warm and wet. Again, thinking about pre-emergent herbicides, right? Thinking about things we're applying. You think about the amount of things we put into the environment in the spring: fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides, and we got to get those insecticides down preventatively for all those insects that might happen, right? And so Carl's great work here in adapting this runoff model. Here are the current conditions indicating red, of course, don't go out and spray. Orange, the risk is still pretty good. Don't go out and spray. And, just in a couple of days, it looks like things are going to dry out. So downstate, up the Hudson Valley, around the Adirondacks, around Lake Ontario, you see it's looking pretty good, but it's still not so good here in central New York, and certainly not very good in the Adirondacks, where Walt Nelson told us today everything's on hold. They got 4 inches of snow on the ground up there. And so by the 8th, or another 4 or 5 days from now, you're going to be in the clear, right? Okay, so now you might want to keep checking back. But this thing, what is this telling me? This is telling me, okay, don't do it today. It probably isn't good for another couple of days. Maybe early next week looks like it's going to dry out and the risk of things moving. Now, here's where we're going to bring it home, Carl. I have been fascinated about how these products move for a really long time. And my colleague, Brian Unruh, down at the University of Florida, who's really sort of pioneered a lot of BMP stuff for the country, both in golf. And of course, I don't think a lot of people know this, but the landscape business is pretty big in Florida too. I don't have to tell you, Carl, you lived in Florida for a while. I mean, they're mowing, blowing, going, feeding 10 months a year in that place. It is a massive industry, and there are a lot of things applied. And so they did this really cool study looking at the lateral movement. These are a couple of new products, but I'm going to draw your attention to prodiamine and diethiopyr in the work. Now, here's what they did. I had AI draw me a 14% slope lawn, Carl. How about that? I put that into the image generator and got a 14% slope. So these guys applied the herbicide on this 14% slope where the red arrow is, for those of you watching on News Channel 8. And then they measured They used annual bluegrass and perennial ryegrass that is sensitive to these herbicides downstream from this thing at different distances to see how much the pre-emergent herbicide moved. Now, originally, the idea was put it down and water it in and it won't move. Well, irrigation did not seem to have a significant impact of the movement in this particular situation. Now, 14% slopes, pretty good size slope, as you can see in this image, right? For those of you watching. So irrigation didn't help you. And so let me draw your attention to what's going on right now. It's pretty wet out there, right? And because it's pretty wet out there, applying things that are going to move with the water is going to be even worse. So what did they find? So that here is the amount of ryegrass, and we got annual bluegrass data too, but this makes the point. This is the amount of ryegrass that was reduced, or the density of the ryegrass, the ground cover of the ryegrass, impacted by the herbicide at 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.5 feet. And so you look, if you put prodiamine down, right, or barricade down, right, it moved about 2 feet 3 weeks after treatment, right? Now they provided simulated rainfall and they irrigated them in and did simulated and normal rainfall, and they got a movement of about 2 feet. Now dimension moved quite a bit further, right? You're talking about moving 4 feet down a slope like this. Now, maybe you got beds there, maybe you got some other areas, but here is in fact, what they found, that all herbicides moved outside that treated area, regardless of the presence of a simulated storm. I mean, just irrigating over time, things move down slopes. And so the wet conditions that we're experiencing now should cause you to think about a few things as we wrap up and Carl and chat about this. First off, I think as Carl said pretty clearly, it looks like climate change, I think the days of gray snow mold are over for a period of time. We don't seem to be getting dumps or persistent snow cover anywhere near like what we used to. The other thing I would say that I'm very concerned about is now that we have got a little bit of snow on the ground, Carl, I'm a little bit concerned that plants near buildings, plants along the sides of the sidewalks are extremely susceptible now to salt that's applied to these surfaces, right? Those plants right adjacent to the sidewalk break dormancy. We apply salts at this time, and that releases and can burn that tissue that's broken dormancy. Normally, you apply salt during the wintertime, those plants are dormant, it doesn't bother them. But once they break dormancy, because it's been warm and now we're getting some snow and people want to plow and put salt everywhere, you're going to see a lot of the damage right now associated with applying salt at this time. And then foot traffic, think about synthetic. Hold off on your fertilizer. We're going to talk more about fertilizer next week, Carl, particularly some of the new urban landscape stuff we're doing with the watershed. So I'm going to shut up and stop sharing. And then if there's any questions, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes. We can answer them.
Yeah. So one comment I'll make, Frank, is just the uncertainty that we have now, not only throughout the whole year, but especially in the spring with, we get going really quick and then we sort of flatline with growing degree days. I was looking at that chart the other day and we were like 120 degree days ahead of normal 4 weeks ago. And then we just sort of flatlined and now we're average, but the way we got to that average, it's a lot more herky jerky than it used to be. And that creates all this uncertainty and, hey, when should I go out? When should I start my pre-emergent? Or when should I think about split applications versus one full rate? And that starts to get to the question that Rich asked. So Rich out there in Cape Cod area, he said, well, he does a prodiamine app first, and then he follows up with the split app of Dimension later in the year that also has the grub control with it. Does he still need to be concerned with the window you were talking about, the germination window? Or is that splitting of the application giving him some leeway there in terms of control?
I think that program, depending on when the second application is, should work perfectly fine. And I certainly understand that seems to be the adaptation that we're having to make. The issue now will come as we stay tied to that approach, as we've talked about with Matt Elmore in the past. Goosegrass now will become a problem. And neither of those products will control goosegrass issues as they start to emerge. So yes, you can get out early and do a second application of a different product for sure. I would not want to have to do any seeding during that period because nothing much comes up. So I don't know how we begin to adapt to building density before a pre. But I think pre's are a part of our culture now. I'm really concerned about putting them out on these wet soils these days.
Yeah. The one sort of interesting thing about what you're doing prodiamine first is the data you just showed, Frank. The prodiamine at least doesn't move quite as much as the dimension. So in that sense, that's probably the order in which you like those things.
Yeah.
So Greg Torvis mentioned treated salt for the sidewalk areas, and we talked about on our conference call this morning, Frank. But you've talked with Dan Scheid, our grounds director here at Cornell, who has maybe experimented around with this, but the cost is very high of that, right? Just the monetary cost versus normal salt, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I think what Dan told us is that it's completely impractical on a large scale throughout the year. Maybe a single application late season, but I think a lot of us are starting to realize that some of the trickiest snows are coming later and later now, at least the last couple of years. And again, with the concerns for liability, and Dan sort of lives his life around this, particularly in an area like that, there are adaptations, as Greg mentioned. He's correct. There are adaptations you should make. And if you have areas or these things are, this goes back to your cost, Carl. Like I know, it is a ritual. Soon they will run up and down all the sidewalks on the 15 miles of 25 miles of sidewalks and replant ryegrass. It's the every year, right? Fixing the soil, seeding them over again. So, maybe it's to the point, as Greg says, use a different salt. And then you don't have to reestablish them. And what's the cost of reestablishing them? And what's the cost of the salt? And then you make a calculus based on that decision.
Yeah. I guess the other tweet I saw the other day, Frank, was about sustainability and sort of as a buzzword. And when we're talking about costs and benefits, there's a lot of factors that go into that equation, right? It's not just turf quality, but in sports fields, it's field safety, right? So in that case, I might be more willing to make a crabgrass pre-emergent or to do some cultural practice in the spring because, hey, I got to keep my athletes safe. And that's a little bit more important than some cosmetic injury on golf course fairways, right? Where the magnitude is for the juice, like is the juice worth the squeeze, right? So in a lot of situations, what you're worried about, is it water quality? Is it field safety? Is it kids running around spraining an ankle? Or is it, hey, the turf looks pink for a couple of weeks, right? All those sort of things.
And I think, and this is also, listen, and just a shout to the sports guys, because I know Greg and I'm sure Ben is here, and others that listen to this on the sports side. This is another opportunity when, you're going to have so much lost field time right now from all the weather conditions when you've got natural grass fields, right? And many communities don't charge for fields, but you pay for it with people complaining and you're like, the quality of fields and blah, blah, blah. And so this might be a good time to discuss, various levels of renovation. It's like, okay, we can just cut drains in and it'll cost us this much and we'll add maybe this many days, right? We can put drains in a 4-inch cap like Trey Rogers and the guys at Michigan State suggest, and it'll cost X and we'll get this many things. We can spend and put 6 inches in and do, and then we can play all the time. And or maybe we should work with other districts and put in some synthetic surfaces that we can use at periods of time, because the kids want and need to get out, Carl, as we've shown and are about to hopefully embark upon a project looking at this. The data is pretty clear, right? Young people benefit from getting out and participating, but the cost of doing it's really high.
Yeah. So so that's 30 minutes, Frank. We again flew by. We don't need a guest. No.
We don't need a guest.
Yeah, we'll be
Well, we
back
get
next.
to a couple of questions. That's good, right? It's good
Yeah.
to get to some questions for people. And maybe, we don't always expect people to participate live in this. We always appreciate everybody that does, but we know we get 100 or so people that listen to this afterwards. Send us an email. We'll read it on the air here and try to
Yeah.
get more answers. But Carl, as we wrap up, I just say, really the point to consider that I think both of us talked about is, we usually have something we're trying to accomplish, and we think about various ways of that go into the decision to do it, right? And I thought you raised a really good point about uncertainty. I just add, as you also said, the other part is there's things we don't know.
Yeah.
The resistance, the runoff, the leaching, and then having to add another application potentially, right? Because we're having to go so early. So I think considering those things is exactly what we need to be talking about it as academics and extension people. And I think hopefully start nudging and planting seeds into the industry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks everybody for joining live. One of our attendees, Rich Bradley, has an AI chat bot thing that can sort of summarize our conversation. So I'm going to take a look at that, and if that's really good, I might just post that in the YouTube link. People can get the
There you go.
Spark Notes version, the Cliff Notes.
Pretty soon you won't even need us.
You won't. They'll know what we're going to say before we say it. So thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you guys next week, Masters Thursday. See you guys.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.